let's look at the importance of oxygen in the atmosphere and the evolution of some more advanced and larger organisms like animals. So we did talk about how oxygen was important with cellular respiration because oxygen is that final electron acceptor as the electrons move through the electron transport chain, and that helps maximize the number of ATP that are generated from each starting glucose molecule. So aerobic and anaerobic respiration starts with glycolysis, that first breakdown of glucose. So aerobic respiration refers to oxygen. So with advanced organisms and larger organisms like animals, glycolysis generates a little bit of ATP, right? 2 molecules, and then the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA entering into the citric acid cycle generates a couple more ATP. But again, most of the ATP is generated through the electron transport chain, right? Up to 32. So that's enough ATP to power and provide energy for some large complex organisms like, animals. However, that first step, glycolysis, glucose into pyruvic acid, in the absence of oxygen, which is anaerobic respiration, like antioxygen, lactic acid is formed and a little bit of ATP is generated. So that's like just this first step without even considering mitochondria. So some simple organisms like bacteria generate enough ATP from the breakdown of glucose to provide the needs of those simple single-celled organisms without oxygen. So glycolysis is the universal energy harvesting process of life, because glycolysis, along with the elaborate processes that occur in the mitochondria and along with oxygen, provides a lot of ATP for aerobic respiration. However, without oxygen, simple-celled things like bacteria and archaea can survive fine via anaerobic respiration, where oxygen is not required at all because they only need a little bit of ATP, enough to supply their single cellular needs. So the role of glycolysis in respiration has an evolutionary basis, right? So about 3.5 to 2.7 billion years ago, before there was very much oxygen in the atmosphere, the ancient prokaryotic organisms, remember a prokaryotic organism is a single-celled organism like a bacterium that has no nucleus. They cannot be more than a single cell. They generated ATP simply from glycolysis and anaerobic respiration. So if we go back in Earth's history from 0 million years ago, or billions of years ago, this is like now, go back to 2.1 billion years ago, 3.5, 4.5 billion years ago, origin of Earth, oldest prokaryotic fossils, direct evidence of prokaryotic organisms, about 3 billion years ago, when they were harvesting energy from simple sugars, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere. So they never were able to really develop aerobic respiration through things like mitochondria. So they survived fine, and they still do today, with simple glycolysis and what we call anaerobic respiration. Okay? As things advanced and the first photosynthetic organisms were able to utilize sunlight energy and the ample carbon dioxide around, the first amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere, in the sense of significant amounts of the atmosphere, started to appear about 2.7 billion years ago. And the atmospheric oxygen concentration kept increasing. When it hit about 10% of modern levels, that set up the stage for the advancement and the development of eukaryotic cells. The first ones were single-celled, and a eukaryotic organism, if you remember, have a nucleus and other organelles, including mitochondria and chloroplasts. So as the atmospheric concentration of oxygen increased, it allowed for the appearance of the eukaryotic organisms, and then most importantly, multicellular eukaryotic organisms like fungi, plants, and animals. So the more advanced eukaryotic organisms, especially the multicellular ones, owe their evolutionary history and appearance based on the fact that atmospheric concentrations of oxygen started to slowly but steadily increase over Earth's history. Now, this is a long time ago, right? 2.1 billion years ago. So glycolysis occurs in almost all organisms, and that suggests that it has a really early evolutionary history in our ancestral organisms. So in the ancestors common to all of life. So the fact that all living things can do glycolysis essentially means that glycolysis is a very old mechanism for harvesting energy and is common for all living things. That means it has a very ancient evolutionary appearance in our common ancestors, if we go way back in the evolutionary tree. And the location of glycolysis also leads to the fact that it is very old in terms of its evolutionary origins. If you remember, glycolysis occurs outside of the mitochondria, not inside the mitochondria. And if you remember the endosymbiotic theory for the appearance of mitochondria and chloroplasts, they were originally ancient prokaryotic organisms that got ingested by a prokaryotic host organism, and instead of being broken down for nutrients, they started to live within the host organism and evolved into mitochondria and chloroplasts, and then the host organism was able to evolve into the eukaryotic organisms with the nucleus. But the fact that glycolysis occurs outside of the mitochondria, meaning the mitochondria are not necessary for glycolysis to occur, is evidence that glycolysis first appeared in organisms before organisms developed organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts, which means that glycolysis first appeared a long, long time ago, along with the first appearance of prokaryotic cells. Okay, so glycolysis does not require these membrane-bound organelles that are found in eukaryotic cells, which means glycolysis most likely evolved much sooner than the eukaryotic organisms did, because the organelles appeared about 1 billion years after the first prokaryotic cells. Okay? So glycolysis is a very old ancient process, and it appeared in the first prokaryotic organisms, way before eukaryotic organisms were able to evolve. And that's it for this chapter.